As the school overseer mentioned, Brother Jones, we're going to talk about a lesson in Jehovah's attributes. The material that I really started developing this talk about 10 years ago. And it used to be delivered in 30 minutes. And, I just sort of added more material to it, and it got to be 60 minutes. And it is now 90 minutes. So, no, I'm not going to give it all tonight. So relax. But it's a mini-series. I'm going to give it tonight and Thursday and Sunday. In other words, this material will take me all 3 meetings to get through. But we're going to look at the way Jehovah deals with people and how Jesus deals with people. And it's a lesson in the attributes that they show, and hopefully you and I can show. Really, that's our goal, isn't it? We'd like to be more like Jesus Christ. He's our exemplar. And if we become more like him, we obviously become more like his Heavenly Father. So we want to be like them in the way in which we deal with people. So we hope that you can learn a lesson in Jehovah's attributes from 2 standpoints. Number one, you should be drawn closer to him, knowing that he is the kind of God that we're going to study that he is. And number 2, maybe there's some ways that you could be more like him in the way you deal with people close to you, your family, your brothers and sisters, even people where you go to school or work or whatever. Would people be surprised to know that you were a Christian if they were judging you by your conduct? Or if you were charged with the allegation of being one of Jehovah's Witnesses, would there be enough evidence in your conduct to convict you? That's something to think about, isn't it? Really. Suppose someone came up to you and they said to you, suppose you're an elder here in Marshville, they come up to you and they say, I'm a brother, I'm moving in from another area, and I wonder if you have a recommendation about where I might serve. Before you answer that, let me tell you about myself. I'm a person who is quick to speak. I'm blunt. I say things when I shouldn't. I get involved in things prematurely. I often say things that I have to be corrected about. I tell you, sometimes I have given the elders in other areas a run for their money. But I'm wondering if you have a place to where I might be able to serve, if you would recommend a place. Now, you're an elder here, and you think to yourself, boy, we have enough of that type here in Marshfield. I understand that there's a real need over in the Quincy congregation. Let's see, we're in the same circuit with them. I understand that some of the congregations up in northern Vermont are really in a need. Would you say that? Well, if you did, you would be turning away an apostle, because in very many ways that describes one of the apostles, Simon Peter. As far as that goes, all of the brothers who were apostles were outstanding examples. Sometimes when we study about them, the brothers, including Simon, isn't it true the carryovers from false religion holds them as being images of holy and, walking around in saint clothes and never deviating? But that's what the Bible says. The Bible teaches you the many attributes of God in the manner in which those men were dealt with. Now, for example, something that's said about them, look in the book of Acts chapter 4, Acts 4, verse 13. This comment was made about the brothers in general, and this is true. It was a complimentary point, really. Acts 4:13 says, now when they beheld the outspokenness, you see that word? The outspokenness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were men unlettered and ordinary, they got to wondering, and they began to recognize about them that they used to be with Jesus. Now, the King James does something here to the Greek word agrammatos. Agrammatos is rendered here in the New World Translation as unlettered. The King James translates that word unlettered as ignorant. Agrammatos, they say, well, that means they're ignorant. Though that was certainly not true. It was not true of Simon. He owned a sizable fishing organization. He dealt with people of at least 2 language groups. The man was industrious. He was a hard worker, and all of these men were certainly not ignorant. Now, you see, they were not lettered. The idea of agrammatos had to do with getting a certificate, some sort of a degree, like you would graduate from some school. And so you'd be given a certificate or a letter. Well, these men didn't have any of that. So why were they so outspoken? Because they were trained by Jesus Christ. That's why they were outspoken. They were qualified. And that's what surprised the men that witnessed them. They didn't have some degree. Isn't that true today? Sometimes we go in service and people look down on us. And they say, well, what can you people possibly have to offer? But if we get into a conversation, all of a sudden they recognize that, hey, these people have something to say. If they would give the truth a chance, they would find out a lot more. But because they prematurely cut us off and don't let us give a chance to get the message across to them, it's unfortunate for them. That's going to cost them their lives in many instances. But we don't go there. And, you go to some of these places with their names on the door, and after their name there's several letters, PhD, DDT, or all these letters that indicate, some secular accomplishment. And but we are unlettered because we haven't graduated or attended one of their theological seminaries. Seminaries, the same thing, same results, dead. But you see, it's very much like the apostles. But let's go back now, and what I'm going to do now, and I've done this, I made this adjustment when I was developing this material. I took the SI book. This is really not hard to do, this kind of material. I took the SI book and the Aid book, a couple of watchtowers. And I, by checking closely in the chart about Jesus' life and ministry, put down the events that we're going to read in the order of their happening. In other words, we're going to follow from the very time Simon learned the truth all the way until the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, and see how Jesus dealt with him and the other brothers there, and learn a lesson about Jehovah's attributes. So John chapter 1 is our first reference, John 1. John was, of course, conducting his ministry. Remember that he was about 6 months ahead of Jesus. And so in John chapter 1, verse 35, it says that the next day John was standing with two of his disciples. Now, they are named later. If you drop down to verse 40, one of them is named Andrew. It says the brother of Simon Peter was one of the two that heard what Jesus said, or John said, and followed Jesus. What did he do with this information? Well, he did the same thing you did. When you learned the truth, very likely, you wanted to tell somebody about it, someone close to you. So he said, this one found his own brother Simon, verse 41, and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which when translated means Christ. Now, he led him to Jesus. Now, here's the first time Jesus ever laid eyes on this man. He's never seen him before. He comes into eye contact with him, and Andrew brings him up. Andrew doesn't say a word, and look at what Jesus says. Jesus looked upon him. He said, you are Simon, the son of John. How'd you like to have someone walk up to you and say, you've never met them before, and tell you your name and who your father is? See, not only did he do that, look at what else he said. You are Simon, the son of John. You will be called Cephas, which is translated Peter. In other words, you are Simon, and from now on you're going to be called something else. I mean, could we maybe have a cup of coffee before we decide this? I mean, is this something arbitrarily we're going to do? See, boom, bing, I met you and I changed your name. See, there must be something behind that. Jesus did not do that to confuse people. There was always a meaning behind what he did, just like with Jehovah. There's always a meaning in his action. Something very, very powerful behind what he was doing. You get an idea of that because look at the next time he meets somebody else. Verse 43 talks about coming into contact with someone else. Drop down to verse 47. Verse 47, it says, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said about him, and again, he's never saw him before, doesn't know the man from Adam. Well, he knows Adam, come to think of it. He helped create him. But anyway, he doesn't know him. He hasn't met him. In verse 47, he says, see an Israelite for a certainty in whom there is no deceit. Next verse, Nathanael says, how do you know that about me? We've never met. You see, Jesus could look at an individual and immediately make an accurate, flawless judgment about the kind of person they were, what they were like inside. He can see right down into the heart. See? So that's why he said, this is an honest man. This man is not deceitful. And so now going back to Simon, what did he see in Simon that made him want to say that you are Simon and from now on you'll be called Cephas? It has to do with the meaning of Peter or Cephas. Anyone know what it means literally? What does it mean literally? Cephas or Peter? Rock. It literally means a piece of rock. So what Jesus saw in this man was a rock-like quality, a stability. This man would be a rock for God. He would be a stabilizing influence in the congregation. If he could just be polished and developed and worked with, he would really be a rock for the congregation of God. Not the foundation stone, which you see false religion has jumped on and made a big deal out of that and blown it out of proportion and also taken it out of context, but nevertheless a rock, a stabilizing influence for the congregation of God. Now, people who maybe were there and knew of this man and knew his disposition, and they may have wondered, I wonder if Jesus knows what he's doing here. I mean, after all, he just met him. I mean, if he'd been around a few weeks ago or yesterday when we had a conversation, you might think of a different story. See, in other words, here's the human element. Isn't that what humans? Aren't we great judges? Humans with their tremendous insight. What do we base our insight on? What we see and what we hear. Big deal. Does that give you the whole picture? How many people know the truth about what happened in all these incidents over the years because the judges base it on two things: limited, what they see, what they hear. That doesn't give you the full story. That's why we have grand juries and hung juries and trials and months and years of deliberation, and you still don't know what the answer is. But see, God and Jesus Christ, Jehovah and his Son, boom, immediately. I mean, there'd be no need for a courtroom. You don't need one. Boom, you're guilty. Innocent, guilty, innocent. Forget about it. So they have tremendous insight there. But humans, they allow Jehovah's process to work in the congregation sometimes, and appointments or recommendations are made, and then humans come up with this: I don't know, I think the brothers made a mistake here. I know they prayed the Holy Spirit, but I don't believe they Wouldn't it be better to leave that matter in the hands of those who are authorized to handle it and let Jehovah take care of that? If there's a need for an adjustment, he'll make it. And not try to second-guess the operation of the Holy Spirit. This is the way congregations have been formed and set up for a century under the direction of God's organization, and they are prospering. The scripture that was cited tonight, wisdom is proved righteous by its works, with what's happened. Learn a lesson from that. At any rate, now, let's go back to the next account I'm taking you is Matthew 18. We're going to be jumping back and forth from account to account, but we're doing this chronologically. Now, suppose you picked up the Bible and you started reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the order in which they appear in the Bible. Look at Matthew chapter 4, and let's look at verses 18 through 20. Walking alongside the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, letting down a fishing net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said to them, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." At once, abandoning the nets, they followed him. Now, if you didn't read the other account, you might think this is the first time they met. In fact, a lot of religious leaders will read this and suggest that this was a spur-of-the-moment decision, snap judgment. Hello, who are you? I'm Jesus. We'll be your followers. No thought behind it, emotional, boom, snap judgment, no real depth in making that decision. But now you should be able to see something. Look at it in verse 18 and tell me what you see there that tells you this can't be their first encounter. Sister Mosley, what do you see? Just answer, please. Yes, he already had his name, see. The truth of the matter is about 6 months has gone by from the time they met in John 1 in this account right here in Matthew 4. You don't get that but you'd get that if you really looked into it carefully and looked at the time frame. But about 6 months has gone by. Not only that, but Matthew does something, and this shows you the value of reading the parallel accounts. So you're at 4 Gospels. So we're going to go to another account, Luke chapter 5, which takes Matthew's 3 verses and gives you a much broader picture of what happened during this incident at Matthew 4, 18 to 20. Let's go to Luke chapter 5 and see how Luke expands on what Matthew reported. Luke gives us a lot more detail. If you look at Luke 5, it talks about Jesus. Verse 3 says, or verse 2 says, he saw 2 boats docked at the lakeside. but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing off their nets. So going aboard one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to pull away a little bit from land. Then he sat down in front of the boat and began teaching the crowds. When he ceased speaking, he said to Simon, now remember, we've got 6 months of association with Christ here. We don't know how many times they really had association or what they did, but there's time. Plus we got this experience. So you're going to see why there's a basis for their becoming Jesus' disciples. It was not a judgment of just made real quickly. It was made after thought and consideration. And look at this experience. It says in verse 4, it says, when he ceased speaking, he said to Simon, pull out to where it is deep, and you men let down your nets for a catch. Now here is the first time you begin to see an indication of Simon's personality, his disposition, his manner of replying to things. Look at what he says. In verse 5, you notice the word but. That tells you something, doesn't it? See, it's a negative. He's going to take exception to what Jesus is asking him to do. But Simon in reply said, instructor, for a whole night we toiled and took nothing, but at your bidding I will lower the nets. You see what he's saying? Instructor, I am a fisherman. I have a business. We've been here all night. There's no fish there. But since you've asked us to do it, we will go ahead and lower the nets. And so they go out and lower their nets. In verse 6 says, well, when they did this, they enclosed a great multitude of fish. In fact, their nets began ripping apart. So they motioned to their partners in the other boat to come and assist them. They did come. They filled both boats, and these began to sink. Seeing this, Simon Peter fell down at the knees of Jesus, saying, depart from me, because I'm a sinful man, Lord. I should have never opened my mouth. Then verse 11 says, so they brought the boats back to land, abandoned everything, and followed him. You see, there was a basis for this action. It was not snap thing, 6 months plus this experience that broke the camel's back. They had a basis for their action. It was based on faith and conviction from their experience with Christ Jesus. It was not like these revivals where people storm up and get baptized and saved, and they go off the next day, go back into the same life pattern, and so forth. We learn another lesson from this, too. We don't force people into categories. People are different. Growth rates vary from person to person. But doesn't it seem reasonable that when we are assisting people, we want them to become disciples? Doesn't it seem reasonable that in a reasonable amount of time, they should be doing something progressively in the interest of the kingdom and God's work, and there should be some sign of appreciation. Hopefully in 6 months, it could be meeting attendance, or maybe it's almost like we're looking for them to drop some of their nets, some of the things that they might be entangled with or hung up on. We're looking for some sign. There's some people who studied longer than the people who are studying with them. They come in, everybody comes in the congregation, people move in, pioneers. There's a study over young conducted, she's been studying about 30 years. They study longer than the people who are in the truth. But we're looking for people that want to make disciples, who want to become disciples. And we find them in a reasonable amount of time. We're looking for some progress. So, show us that you really want to serve God. You just don't want the companionship of his people. It's nice to have good companions, but what good is it if you're not serving the Creator, see? So we're looking for signs of progress when we work to help people. A year goes by from the time Jesus first met Peter. A year goes by. Or from the time Jesus took them as his disciples, and he's going to make the appointment to the office of apostle. And that takes us to the book of Matthew chapter 10, and verse 2. You'll notice here that, of course, this was another case of Jesus spending a lot of time. This is somewhere around the year 31 of the Common Era. Jesus prays all night in making this appointment to Jehovah. He seeks the guidance of the Holy Spirit, obviously, and as he says there, Matthew 10, verse 2 says, the names of the 12 apostles are these, and then he lists them. Now, you'll notice there, he mentions first Simon, the one called Peter, and then his brother Andrew. Now, that's an interesting point to note about the mention of the apostles. Invariably, throughout the Scriptures, every time they're mentioned by name, generally, in almost all instances, Simon Peter is mentioned first. For some reason, we really don't know. It could be because of his impetuous nature. He generally was the spokesman for the group self-appointed, or whatever the case. He generally was the one that spoke up, or whatever the case is. He's always mentioned first at any rate. Now, sometime shortly after he was appointed as an apostle, they were in a situation. This is in Luke chapter 8. This is our next account. Luke chapter 8. And I want you to imagine a scene at a district convention. Very, very crowded, almost like at break time, and you know there's not enough food. You know, it's really crowded, and people are, in this particular instance, were pushing and shoving and trying to get a glimpse of, maybe even speak to, or even come in contact with Jesus Christ, this man that could cure the sick, could raise the dead even, give sight to blind people. Amazing. If we can just meet him or maybe speak to him, maybe he can do something for us. See, that was their mentality. And so in verse 42 of Luke chapter 8, you'll see there where a new paragraph starts. You'll see it says, as he was going, the crowds thronged him. You see that word thronged? That's almost like if you've been at a big convention that we've had maybe in the summer, the crowds get so thick that you don't even have to move. You just kind of go like this and the crowd moves you along, you know. So really, that was the way it was. So imagine that kind of circumstances, very crowded and people pushing maybe and anxious to get into contact with Jesus. So with that in mind, verse 42 says, as he was going, the crowd thronged him. Verse 43 says, a woman subject to a flow of blood for 12 years, who had not been able to get a cure from anyone, approached from behind and notice, touched the fringe of his outer garment, just the fringe. And instantly her flow of blood stopped. Now, think about that. Think about yourself being in that situation and someone coming up and touching the edge of your jacket or your sweater or your coat. Would you notice that? You know, would you say, someone touched my coat? Well, see, that was sort of the situation here, because in verse 45, it says, so Jesus said, who was it that touched me? Now, nobody wanted to own up to it. In fact, no, not me. I didn't do it. It says, when they were all denied, Peter said, instructor, the crowds are hemming you in and closely pressing you. Do you see what he's saying? Instructor, that doesn't make sense. Everybody's touched you. I'm being touched. We're all touched. What are you talking about? Who touched me? See, Jesus didn't say, you don't know what I'm talking about. You're always jumping out of the lane. Why don't you just wait? He didn't say that. He said, yet someone touched me, for I perceived that power went out from me. Oh. I thought you meant foot and mouth. And then verse 47 says, seeing that she had not escaped notice, the woman came trembling and fell down before him and disclosed before all the people the cause for which she touched him and how she was healed instantly. He said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go your way in peace. Jesus always maintained his composure. He didn't let the shortcomings or imperfections of others cause him to lose his Christian personality. A good example for you and I, to bear up under these types of things and hope that people can do the same with us, and not to take ourselves so seriously that we feel that everything's got to be just so. Things are never just so. Now, sometime after this, Jesus was wanting to get away to himself. Look at Matthew chapter 14. Next chronological record takes us to Matthew 14. Jesus was tired. He wanted some time to himself. You'll see why he was tired when you get to Matthew 14. He just got through feeding 5,000 people. That would tire you out even if you're perfect. So in verse 23, Matthew 14:23, says, eventually, having sent the crowds away, he went up into the mountain by himself to pray. Though it became late, he was there alone. Now, what about the boat or the brothers? It says, by now the boat was many hundreds of yards away from land, being hard put to it because the wind was against them. So you get the picture. This is like late at night, actually around 3 o'clock in the morning to be specific. And there's a wind storm developing over the water. They're several hundred years away from the shore. Jesus is up in the mountain to pray, and they're apparently having a great deal of trouble keeping this boat erect. And so in verse 25 it says, now imagine this windstorm developing. There's probably a lot of howling. The boat's rocking back and forth. And it says, but in the fourth watch period of the night, he came to them walking over the sea. when they caught sight of him walking on the sea, the disciples were troubled, saying it is an apparition, or we're hallucinating. This is a vision. It's not real. And they cried out in their fear. Well, you'd probably do that, wouldn't you? You're in the boat and it's about to turn. Here comes somebody walking across the water. What would you do? Scream? Faint? Fall out of the boat? But now, when they cried out in their fear, Jesus recognized they were afraid of this, what they considered to be a hallucination. So he says, "Take courage, it is I, have no fear." In reply, Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you over the water." Is that you, really? If it is, I want to do what you're doing, and so prove it. So Jesus says, "Come." Now, this takes an element of faith here on Simon's part, because he does step over the edge of the boat, puts his foot on the water, and starts walking across the water and going toward Jesus. What a miraculous experience. It was a miracle. I mean, can you imagine being involved with Jesus in that miracle, walking on the water? He must have been speechless. And he starts walking toward Jesus. But now notice in verse 30, tell me, if you look closely, what was it that caused him to get afraid and then start to sink? You see closely? But looking at the windstorm, he got afraid. And after starting to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, stretching out his hand, Jesus caught hold of him and said to him, "You with little faith, why did you give way to doubt?" And they got into the boat, and the windstorm abated. You see, Peter was distracted by his environment. His circumstances, or the things around him, distracted him, and he took his eyes off of the person he was involved with, the one he knew had all the answers and all the marbles and all the cards. And he let himself be distracted, and as a result, he lost out on a privilege of being involved with Jesus in a miracle. Lesson? This is a lesson for us. When you get dedicated to Jehovah God, you become a disciple of his Son, Jesus Christ. A very special, a very precious, a relationship to be treasured. But is it possible that the windstorms around us, whatever they may be, our personal lives, pursuits of the world, domestic problems, economic pressures, what about this? What about that? What about the other? What about the, and you hear people say, "I can't do this, I can't do this." We got to be practical. And if they keep their eyes on their goal and stay involved with Jesus Christ, they wouldn't let these things intimidate them. Because there are many brothers and sisters all around the world in far better and far worse circumstances than any of us are in, and they're faithfully serving God. Why? Because they have their eyes attuned to what they're doing. They're not distracted by their environment. They don't let problems of this system intimidate them and cause them to weaken or lose faith and to sink, as it were, in their activity. And then if something happens that we do fall into that kind of situation, are we wise enough and intelligent enough, the way Simon was, to know where to look to for help? He says, "Lord, save me." He knew where to look. Now, just recently, the Faithful and Discreet Slave, which has been authorized by Jesus Christ to reach out into the congregation, as it were, and to help those persons who are spiritually unstable, or perhaps they have drifted away, become inactive, no longer participating in the modern-day miracle of producing disciples. And what you do in changing people's personality and help them to serve God is far more impressive than walking on water. And the slave has recommended that the elders call on them, and recommended that they have the basic provision that builds faith. You need a regular Bible study. At this point, it doesn't seem that you're able to handle this yourself. We'd like to recommend a strong brother or mature couple or sister that can work with you and study the Bible. Don't worry about service right now. We'd like to get you back on your feet spiritually so that you can, again, enjoy the kingdom activity. You realize how many people, when the hand of Christ, through that arrangement, was extended to them, have said, "No, I don't want that." How could somebody that dedicated their life to God come to that conclusion? I don't know. But they have. Many of them have. Is it pride? Maybe it is. Maybe they don't want to be helped. Well, we're still going to offer because it's Jesus' hand. Can you imagine, though, Peter said, "That's okay, Lord, I'll take care of it. Goodbye, see you later, Simon." He would have died. His life was at stake. Far more greater today, our life is at stake. But isn't it true that so often there's so much going on around us in this world of windstorms whipped up by the system and our own imperfect flesh and the system's God, the devil, that it's so easy to be distracted and to be taken away and lose our attention, say we are in the last days, this system is going to be destroyed. If we don't get our spiritual act together and help others do the same, they are going to lose their lives, and we might lose our lives because we didn't help them. So it's a very serious responsibility, something to think about. At any rate, there's a lesson in all of these accounts for our benefit today. Now, what Jesus says, and the situation comes up that's very interesting in John chapter 6. John chapter 6 and verse 19 tells us, in verse 19, however, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, John 6:19, they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they beheld Jesus walking upon the sea. So you see, actually what was happening, Jesus was up in the mountain. He walked down to the water and they were actually going across the sea to get to the other side, and he caught them before they reached the other side. He was walking 3 or 4 miles in that issue. So he was not just right off the coast or, just a few hundred feet, but 3 to 4 miles he was walking. No wonder they were scared. So they said, how could this happen? Well, that's what happened. In the same chapter, Jesus brings up an interesting point. Go over to chapter 6 and verse 50 and verse 51. Jesus makes a point here. He says, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And for a fact, the bread that I shall give is my flesh in behalf of the life of the world." Now, he said that. Now, that would cause an immediate reaction from the Jews and those listening to him, including his disciples. In fact, you'll see in verse 52, they started continuing with one another. The Jews began to continue with one another. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Is he crazy? What's he talking about? Eat my flesh and drink my blood. That's repulsive. I'm getting out of here. That's exactly what happened too. In fact, it says in verse 60, not only did the Jews leave, it says, therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, "This speech is shocking. Who can listen to it?" So, verse 66 says, owing to this, many of his disciples went off to the things behind and would no longer walk with him. That statement, if you wanted to look at it this way, that statement stumbled them out of the truth. Now, had they waited, they would have found out that he was speaking in a figurative manner. But notice what happens now in verse 67. Therefore Jesus said to the 12, he turned and looked at the apostles, and said, "You do not want to go also, do you?" Notice what Simon said. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, whom shall we go away to? You have sayings of everlasting life, and we have come to, and believed and come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Simon didn't know what Jesus meant when he said, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood," any more than those men that left. What he did know is that this man was God's son. He said, "I know this much. I know where I've learned the truth. I'm convinced that you are God's son. And I know that whatever you are saying will be instructed and will be explained and expounded upon. But where am I going to go? Really, what option do I have? I mean, you've got the everlasting life in your hands, and so we're not leaving." So he was right. Isn't that very much like it is today? Sometimes people get bent out of shape about God's channel of communication. I know an issue that still comes up now and again is the issue over chronology. 1975. The society and the critics will say, well, witnesses predicted the end of the world in 1975. They predicted in 1914. Well, let me tell you something. I was at Brooklyn in 1966 when the book that released that information was released. In the back of the Life Everlasting and Freedom of the Sons of God, the chart read 1975, end of 6,000 years of man's existence, and so forth, the chart. And so that was a big thing that year. I was there until 1970 when I left and got married to Leslie, and we pioneered thereafter. But during all those years, from 1966 when that information was released until 1975 and thereafter, if you want to know my personal impression, I never, ever thought the governing body was making a prediction. I was never given that impression, and I was right there under their noses for 6 years. And I never got that impression. I remember being at the a convention in Maryland when Brother Franz released that book, and he brought up the point. He says, here we are in 1966, he says, does this mean that Armageddon will come in 1975? Quote, he said, it could, but we're not saying. And he said to the audience, and don't you say either. But it was said, and it was said by a lot of people. It was said by a lot of people who were prominent, unfortunately, and the governing body apologized for that impression that was left. But I'm just making a point here that sometimes people hear things that to them have shock value, and they, well, I'm not going to do this anymore. And they went off to the things behind. Now, where are those people now that took exception to that statement and overreacted to that information? Where are they? Are they serving God? Are they studying the Bible? Are they looking out for people and helping them to come to know Jehovah God and His purpose? Are they preaching the good news of the kingdom like they're supposed to be doing in the last days? They're not doing any of that thing. Most of them have drifted back into a life of self-gratification, and that's really the only option. What are you going to do, really? I mean, if you left, would you go back to Babylon the Great? Some of them have, unfortunately. You're going to go back and drown yourself in some self-gratifying lifestyle of immorality and live in an immoral cesspool of the system. You're going to do that? You're going to get involved in materialism, just drown yourself in pleasure-oriented lifestyles and just get all the pleasure you can and suffer the bad conscience of leaving the organization of God's people? Where did you learn the truth? Who taught you the Bible? Can you find an organization that's clean, morally, spiritually, one that stays no part of the world? Where are you going to go away to? So Simon was really right on in this statement, wasn't he? He said, Master, we don't have any place to go. We know where everlasting life is coming from, so we're not leaving. So what a good example of loyalty there. Go back to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16, soon after this incident was over, things settled down for a while. Jesus was going to do or ask some questions about what the public was saying about him. So in Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 13, Jesus asked this question: who are men saying the Son of Man is? In other words, tell me, what do you hear in the streets? What's the public saying about me? So the disciples answered, well, some say John the Baptist. Others are saying that you're Elijah. Others think you're Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So he just said, well, what about you? What do you think? You see what the answer is and who gave the answer? In answer, Simon Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And there was absolutely no question about that in Peter's mind. This was God's Son. So he recognized that. Now, what Jesus is going to do in verse 21 is pinpoint one of the culminating acts he is going to go through in coming to the earth. He says, what's going to happen to me is I'm going to be taken to Jerusalem. I'm going to be delivered up. Notice he says, I'm going to suffer many things by the older men and the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day I'll be raised up. So the reaction to this now, this is God's purpose. This represents one of the chief acts of Jesus Christ in coming to the earth. This would be the culminating act of his vindicating his Father's name by being loyal to death, redeeming mankind. Notice in verse 22, at this Peter took him aside and commenced rebuking him, not reproving. Reproving is strong. Rebuking is the strongest type. It's almost a tongue lashing. Can you imagine rebuking Jesus Christ? Get over here. Let me talk to you. What in the world is wrong with you? You don't even go near Jerusalem. You stay right here. We'll take care of the whole thing. In fact, you're being too hard on yourself. Relax. In fact, he says that, doesn't he? Be kind to yourself, Lord. In verse 22, you will not have this destiny at all. We just won't stand for it. Can you imagine? Now, that type of thinking was negative. And so it needed correction. And so Jesus, very straightforwardly, did correct it. He was very firm. It says in verse 23, but turning his back, he said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me because you think not God's thoughts but those of men. You are thinking physically. You are not thinking spiritually. So get out of my way. Get behind me. You're an opposer. You're just like Satan. I'd just like to have Jesus tell you that. Now, you think that might be possible today? We could take that sort of a be kind to yourself attitude. Oh, yeah. We see it in the congregations. I'll start when I was at Brooklyn. When we went to Bethel, when I went there and served there, often the brothers would tell me, I would see them, they kind of look dejected and downtrodden. I'd say, what's wrong? My parents just called last night. What's wrong? Oh, they're kind of tugging at me. They want me to come home. And sometimes the parents and maybe sisters that knew the brother before we went to Bethel would be calling up and say, is your time up yet? Like they're in some prison or something. When do you get out? When do you bail out or something? And come home, we need you, we miss you. Or someone in the congregation might be interested in going to Bethel. And, well, I don't know. You go to Bethel, there's a lot of work there. You could stay right here. I mean, we could use your help right here. Why don't you be kind to yourself and stay with us? See, let the fleshly ties take over. And really, is that really the same kind of attitude? Yes, it is. Or someone says, I want to be a Gilead missionary. I want to go into the overseas field. I tell you what, overseas they've got bugs. And I know some of those people come back and they walk around half dead. They'll give you 3 weeks. You'll be dead time you get over there. It's terrible over there. Why don't you stay here in Pioneer? See, what kind of negative thinking is that? Instead of saying, well, isn't that wonderful? Is there any way I could be of assistance to you? Let me encourage you. That's wonderful you have that zeal. Or do we let the human emotion take over and take this be kind to yourself attitude and sort of have that attitude? So, interesting, isn't it? We could show the same disposition. Really we could discourage people from really fulfilling God's purpose here in the last days, just like Simon did. I want you to notice something Jesus did physically. Verse 23 says, it says he turned his back. Now, there was a reason why he turned his back. He was not just sort of, turning his back and rejecting Simon. There was a reason for that movement. And the reason for the movement is shown us in the parallel account. Don't lose this. We'll come back to this. But look at Mark chapter 8. In verse 33, and you'll find out why he turned. Look at Mark 8:33. Notice it says, he turned, looked at his disciples, and rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, because you think not God's thoughts but those of men. So why did he turn? He was turning because he wanted to look straight in the eyes of the other brothers that were present at that meeting. Those other men. You know why? Because he knew they were thinking exactly the same thing. Peter just had the guts to say it. But he says, all of you you're thinking man's thoughts, not God's thoughts. So all of you are really like opposers to me. And that's true in a congregation. Sometimes the elders might be aware that there may be one or two persons who are very negative, and they always bring up the matters of discouragement, or they show a bad spirit. And so they want to work with that. They want to be aware of that and deal with it. On the other hand, if they're perceptive, if they're thinking and they're probing and they're looking and they're sensitive, they might find out that quite a few people feel that way. And so it may require that they deal with it on a much greater basis than perhaps one or two individuals. So it takes being in touch with things, doesn't it? It takes being sensitive and being able to listen to and watch the indications of how people are thinking. You just can't say, well, as long as we don't hear anything, we'll assume everything is okay. That's not really a good thing to do when you're dealing with people's lives or their spiritual condition. In Matthew 16, look at the very last verse in Matthew 16, verse 28. Right after this incident, Jesus made the statement, truly I say to you that there are some of those standing here that will not taste death at all until first they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now you think about how that must have impressed those men when they heard that. I'm telling you right now, there are some of you standing right here in my midst that will not taste death until you see the Son of Man come into his kingdom. That's amazing. Well, that's good news, isn't it? Think about what they may have been thinking when he made that statement. Now you can understand why they would make questions. Lord, are you restoring the kingdom of Israel at this time? Is it going to be right now? Next week? Next year? There's a basis for that. But now, how is Jesus going to fulfill that promise? He will fulfill that promise by what he does in chapter 17. Chapter 17 fulfills that promise. Why? Because 3 of those men he's going to take on the mountain of transfiguration and let them see him in his kingdom glory, like a foregleam, like a preview of what he would look like in the kingdom, glorious and brilliant. And so who did he take? 3. Verse 17:1. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and James and John, his brother, brought them into a mountain by themselves. Now, isn't that interesting? Just last week, think about if you were him, what you would do. Let's see now. I've got to take of these 12. I've got to take 3 with me up to this mountain. This is a very, very special privilege. Who will I not take? Let's see. Simon. He's always jumping in there and causing trouble, and he's always speaking out of turn. And he caused that big upset last week. Let's just put him on a shelf about 50 years and let him learn a lesson. That's just the way a human would think, isn't it? But see, Jesus picked him. He says, Simon, you're the rock. I want you to be in that group, so come with me.